Hello, U.S. History students, and welcome to Unit 6, Lesson 2, American Reactions to the Outbreak of World War II. In the years leading up to the outbreak of World War II in 1939, Americans are scared. They see the rise of Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin, and they see what they're doing in their respective countries, and they're fearful that this is going to cause another war on the same level or worse than World War I. And it's because of this fear that Congress passes a series of neutrality acts. And the purpose of these acts are to make it illegal for companies to sell weapons or transport goods to any nation at war. And part of the reason for this is looking back at World War I, when we're shipping supplies to our allies and the Germans are sinking the ships, causing losses of life as well as losses of goods. Americans don't want to see this happen again. And so these neutrality acts are put in place to prevent those situations from occurring again. Roosevelt wants a more active response to stopping these dictators. He doesn't like what he's seeing them do. And he feels like even though the United States is not part of the League of Nations, we still need to try to help stop what's happening. But he fails to convince other world leaders to quarantine or isolate these aggressor nations by 1937. And then it really starts on September 1st of 1939. When Germany invades Poland. Now, thinking back to lesson 6.1, you recall that Hitler wants Lebensraum, or living space, for his Aryan race, for his German empire. And he feels that taking over land is the way to do that. He's wanting to get back not only the land that he lost in World War I, or his nation lost in World War I, but also as much other land as possible. So he invades Poland in 1939, and World War II officially begins because this is an act of aggression. And just like World War I, all it takes is one spark, and the spark for World War II is Germany invading Poland. When the war begins, though, Congress amends the Neutrality Acts and begins to allow U.S. companies to sell weapons to the Allies, so only our friends, on a cash and carry basis. And what cash and carry really means is that the only way that Americans would sell these goods or provide these goods to their allies, being Britain and France, is if they paid for the goods in full and transported them themselves. So no longer is the United States going to be involved in making sure that these goods are getting transported or offering them on loan. The countries that are buying these goods now have to pay in cash and transport on their own ships because America is trying to learn from the lessons of World War I. And this cash and carry policy allows the U.S. to aid the Allies while still remaining neutral to avoid the causes of American entry into the First World War. We're looking back. We're learning from history at this point. From 1939 to 1940, the German military conquers most of Europe and then begins bombing Britain. So as you can see on our map in the top left, all of that orange now belongs to Germany. And they start to bomb Great Britain as a means of trying to get them to surrender. At this point, airplanes are very prominent, and we do use them for bombing in World War II. And so they would go through and they would do what's called blitzkrieg, or lightning war. And it's where they would just come through and bomb wave after wave after wave in an attempt to get Great Britain to surrender. By 1940, Roosevelt is elected to an unprecedented third term as president. No president in American history had ever been elected a third term. And his campaign platform for this third term was neutrality, but with preparedness. So we're going to still remain neutral. We're not going to get involved. But we need to look forward to the possible, prospect of the United States joining in this war. And so FDR prepares for this entry by calling for the first peacetime draft. We're not going to be caught off guard. We need to start building up our military as a just-in-case measure. And so the draft means that you would sign up and you would have the possibility of being called. And if you're called, you have to go. You have to serve. The fall of France in 1940 really worries Americans that the Axis powers might really win. We're looking at all of the newsreels and the newspapers and seeing all the land that they're taking over, and we're really afraid that this might be our defeat. That might be defeat for the Allied powers. The German Luftwaffe, or the German Air Force, attacks on Britain mean that England needs U.S. aid more than ever. But we're still in this neutrality kick, and we're not going to offer them anything but the cash and carry clause. And so here's a quote from Winston Churchill. "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Winston Churchill is the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, and essentially FDR's British counterpart. So we start thinking about it, and we can't continue with the cash and carry because our allies need our help. France has fallen. Great Britain's at great risk of falling. So we respond to this with the Lend-Lease Act in 1941. This act allows the U.S. to send war supplies to allied nations and transport war-related goods to Europe on armed ships. So we're still taking precaution. We're no longer transporting them on passenger vessels like we did in World War I, because we know there are German submarines in the Atlantic Ocean. Unrestricted submarine warfare is still part of their arsenal. So instead of transporting the goods on passenger liners like we did with the Lusitania, for example, we're going to start transporting these goods on military armed ships. The Lend-Lease Act is used throughout the war. It transforms the U.S. into an arsenal of democracy, that's what it's ended up nicknamed, and helps end the Depression in America because we are ramping up production. We're not involved in the war yet, but we know our friends need our help, so we're going to start making bombs, building ships, airplanes, guns, all of the war materials that are needed for our friends to fight the Germans. We're going to start producing those. And that's going to allow for more jobs in the United States. In a time when 25% approximately of the United States is out of a job, those war munitions jobs are going to be of great use to the nation. And it's really that ramping up for World War II that finally does end the Great Depression that's gone on for over a decade now, over 10 years. By 1941, the U.S. is entangled in this dangerous war. We know the Germans are out there with their submarines. Hitler has stabbed Stalin in the back, gone back on his Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, and invaded the Soviet Union. Because again, Hitler's land greedy. He wants as much land as he possibly can for his Third Reich, his Third German Empire. And Japan is starting to take over not only Pacific Islands, but also mainland Asia. And no one's really there to stop them. We've seen within the Japanese realm of the Pacific that for 10 years now, they've been trying to take over as much land as they can for natural resources because Japan is an island. In order for them to expand and become a world power, they must have natural resources that they cannot produce on their own land. So they began taking over land. The successes of these Axis powers in Europe bring the U.S. closer and closer to an undeclared war on Germany. We see what they're doing. This is a time period when, if you go to the movie theater, you see what's called newsreels. And these newsreels depict what's happening during the war. You also see it in all the headlines on all the newspapers. So the American people are very well versed in what's happening in Europe. And FDR gives the Navy and merchant ships the authority to attack German U-boats. If the German U-boats come up to us and try to attack us, shoot first. So then Roosevelt meets with British Prime Minister Churchill, and they know each other. You know, they're friends. And they secretly draft an Atlantic Charter. And the purpose of the Atlantic Charter is a war strategy that's going to outline what's going to happen during the war, as well as after the war. And some of these things follow along with Wilson's 14 points back from World War I. For example, the United States and Great Britain can't gain territory from the war. They oppose any territorial changes made against the wishes of the people. So self-determination, allowing a nation to govern themselves as they wish. And it eventually sets up the beginnings of what becomes the United Nations after World War II. The U.S. then turns its attention to Japan, and they try to stop the Japanese aggression in Asia as a means of protecting American territories in the Pacific, because if you recall, we still have the Philippines, we have Wake Island, Midway Island, and Hawaii. So FDR orders an embargo, which is a ban on trade on all iron and oil sales to Japan. Iron is needed to create their war machine, to build their guns and ships and planes. And they need oil because Japan doesn't have any oil natural resources. So they need that oil to run their war machine, to fuel their ships, to fuel their airplanes, and things of that nature. And a lot of that they're getting from the United States at this point. So FDR orders this ban on trade. We're not going to offer you this anymore. You're on your own. In hopes that that's going to essentially get Japan to stop, because they're not going to have the materials they need. Hideki Tojo sent an envoy to negotiate a resolution. So he sends people to the United States to negotiate how to solve this problem. You don't want us attacking all these other countries. We don't want you to ban our goods. So they're on the front basically trying to negotiate an end to the embargo, but secretly they're plotting to attack the United States because they're angry. This leads to December 7th, 1941. The Japanese military leads a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This is very pivotal because this is where majority, if not all, of the Pacific Fleet for the United States is held. And we do have a few ships that are away from Pearl Harbor, but this is our main base in the Pacific. This is a Sunday morning. Our ships had just been refueled the night before. And this is a surprise attack. We were not expecting this. So let's look now at a newsreel from that day to give us a little bit of understanding of how they felt.
December 7th, 1941. No American will ever forget this Sunday morning in Hawaii. Across the blue waters of Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Fleet rides serenely at anchor. There is peace and quiet in Honolulu. There is a hope for peace in the hearts of all Americans. There is a forceful plea for peace in the words of the President of the United States. But his last message to Japan's emperor falls on deaf ears. Grim silence is the reply. No outward sign reveals what may be the nature of the Mikado's answer. In Washington, Secretary of State Hull continues peace negotiations with Jap Ambassador Nomura and Special Envoy Kurusu, not knowing the genial smiles mask murder in their hearts. Hawaii's bright Sunday becomes a black Sunday. High overhead, Jap raiders are on the loose. Without warning, they circle Pearl Harbor and the city of Honolulu. A surprise attack born of infamy. Sirens screech the alarm too late. Already the yellow men have unloosed their bombs. Flames sweep the Waikiki district. Sky rains death and destruction. Caught unawares on this fateful Sunday morning, Americans quickly and calmly evacuate the danger districts.
This was Pearl Harbor, America's prime naval base in the Hawaiian Islands. 19 proud ships rested on the bottom. 4,572 men were dead, wounded, or missing. In the hands of Japan rested the balance of power in the Pacific. Bought at a known cost of 48 planes shot down, 3 midget submarines, perhaps 150 men.
Hickam failed. In all, 97 Army planes were destroyed, according to the figures in the plain-spoken disclosure given by the United States government to the American people about the facts of Pearl Harbor. This is the root of what President Roosevelt has called the day that will live in infamy. Infamy that this nation is avenging.
In addition to bombing Hawaii, the Japanese also attack U.S. naval bases at Guam and Wake Island, 2 of our territories that we gained back in the Spanish-American War that we now use as military bases in the Pacific. After these Japanese attacks, the very next day, FDR meets with Congress and says, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, which essentially means that this date from now on is going to be known for this horrible deed that was done to the United States by the Japanese. When America enters World War II, the U.S. is now fighting a 2-front war. Not only are we fighting the Japanese in the Pacific, but we're also helping our allies fight Germany in Europe. Because of this, now we have to split our military, split our resources. But despite the attack that Japan just launched on us, FDR really views Germany as the immediate threat. So we're going to go after Germany first, help our allies with Germany first, and then we're going to continue to fight the war in the Pacific. But our main focus is going to start with helping our allies in Europe. This brings us to the end of Unit 6, Lesson 2, American Reactions to the Outbreak of World War II. I hope you have a great day.